I'll now invite Marianne to share her screen. Excellent. Thank you, Marianne.
All right.
And it looks like just about everyone is here, and we will begin. This webinar will run 1 hour and a half, and we are currently recording. Editors Canada welcomes you to Marianne Ward's webinar, Working with an Editor, an Overview for Writers. Before we begin, Editors Canada respectfully acknowledges that we are on and work on the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, Inuit, First Nations, Métis, in what we now call Canada. We honor the ancestry, heritage, and gifts of the Indigenous peoples and give thanks to them. And now I'd like to introduce the presenter of today's webinar. As a freelancer, Marianne Ward has edited a wide variety of material, including magazine articles, plays, and PhD dissertations, but since 2007, she has primarily worked as a book editor. Her clients have included publishers from Vancouver, BC to St. John's, Newfoundland, as well as individual authors across Canada and in the United States and Europe. She does all stages of book editing, from manuscript assessments to substantive editing, copy editing, and proofreading for everything from picture books to middle grade, YA, and adult fiction and nonfiction. Among the hundreds of manuscripts she has edited are numerous books that have won provincial, regional, and national awards. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you so much, Carol, and hello, everyone. I appreciate that land acknowledgement you gave, Carol. I'm joining you all from my home office in Boonamagwadi. That's the original Mi'kmaq name for what is now known as Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The word translates to either tom cod ground or salmon place, after the fish that were found in the harbor here. I can see the harbor from my home, looking across to Halifax, and I am truly, sincerely grateful to live, work, and play in Mi'kma'ki, the beautiful ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I'm also really grateful for this opportunity to speak with you all about editing. As a lifelong reading enthusiast and someone who is deeply passionate about the written word, I've got a dream job. I've actually been able to monetize my obsession with spelling and punctuation. Don't get me started on the serial comma. Actually, you can feel free to ask me about it. Mine is a job where being a slow reader is, in fact, an asset. Not only do I get paid to read, but best of all, I get to collaborate with people for whom I have the utmost admiration, writers. Because I primarily work as a book editor, that will be the focus of this presentation, though much of what I'm sharing about working with an editor applies to any writing. I should mention off the top that although I have recently started proofreading poetry for Gasborough Press, I do not edit poetry. The focus of my presentation, therefore, is fiction and nonfiction. I should also mention that I have never worked in-house for a publisher, though I do a lot of work with book publishers, and I've worked very closely with one publisher in particular from the very start of my career as a book editor. There are several types of editors, one for each stage of editing, and there are various definitions and names for the stages of editing. In this presentation, I'll delineate as best I can the various stages of editing and roles of editors, share some specific guidelines for working with an editor, some tips and recommendations that will help ensure a smooth process for both writer and editor, get into some nitty-gritty about hiring a freelance editor, and as Carol mentioned, I will leave lots of time to address your questions about editors and editing. She will be watching for any questions you post and will aim to address all of them at the end of the presentation. I'll also pause a couple of times along the way to see if you have any questions about what we've just covered. I thought I would start by giving an introduction to who editors are, the particular attributes that set them apart. In other words, why working with an editor is different than soliciting feedback from members of your writing group or your former English teacher or your best friend who's a big reader. An editor is a professional. an impartial reader with a particular skill set and expertise in the process of turning a manuscript into a book. They represent your ideal reader, one that is engaged, knowledgeable, discerning. They're a fresh pair of eyes that will be able to see and assess what's on the page, the trees and the forest, the big picture and the details, what's there and what's missing. And they are your companion in the journey to turn your manuscript into a book. On their website, Editors Canada offers the following description of an editor's interests and abilities. Quote, editors are intrigued by language. They enjoy finding just the right word to convey a point, making sense of a complicated piece of information, and manipulating text until it flows flawlessly. They have a passion for detail and accuracy. They notice illogical arguments and poorly constructed sentences, end quote. They go on to say, quote, an editor is not only must not only be proficient in grammar, spelling, and composition, but also have the ability to visualize the end product while focusing on remembering details, think logically and exercise good judgment, reorganize a document to achieve clarity and momentum, recognize what's missing in a passage, use a wide range of reference materials, and work within deadlines. Finally, they say, editors are skilled at identifying the most appropriate structure, format, and content for each audience and purpose. Ultimately, editors are people who think, and they do so on behalf of both the writer and the reader. Think of the editor as an intermediary between you and your readers. Here's another excerpt from the Editors Canada website. The editor is responsible, along with the writer, for ensuring that the document is accurate enough to satisfy the most informed reader, clear enough for even a novice to follow, and interesting enough to catch and hold the attention of all readers. They're speaking generically about any document, but those three responsibilities certainly apply to nonfiction. I especially like the balance described there: clear enough for the novice, accurate enough for the expert, and interesting for all readers. Indeed, one of the principal goals of editing is to help the writer communicate clearly. I feel that's very much at the core of what I do as an editor and how I can be of best service to both the writer and the reader. Editing brings a sharper focus to the writing, clearing away any unnecessary clutter that might confuse or distract the reader so that your message and the elegance of your wordsmithery can shine through. When it comes to books, here's the bottom line. In order to have a manuscript published, you will work with an editor. In fact, you'll almost certainly work with several editors. Editing is as essential to publication as writing is. The two go hand in hand. The editor's job is to help you prepare your manuscript for being turned into a book. You may have heard it put this way: authors don't write books, they write manuscripts. Working with an editor is a key part of the process that turns a manuscript into a book. In its description of the book, What Editors Do: The Art, Craft, and Business of Book Editing, the University of Chicago Press says the following, quote, editing is an invisible art where the very best work goes undetected. This makes it all the more difficult to truly understand the range of roles editors inhabit while shepherding a project from concept to publication. That's what I'm shining a light on here: the range of roles inhabited by editors as they work to turn your manuscript into a book. We'll be working through the stages of editing and roles of editors as outlined on this slide. The editor's raison d'etre is to help you achieve the best book possible, the most complete, accurate, refined, polished version of the book you set out to write, one that you can feel proud to take full ownership of. It's your book, it's your name on the cover, it's your vision realized. The editor's job is to help this come to pass. As a side note, The publisher's name is also on the cover. The editor's name is not. In the case of traditional and partner book publishing, the editor is also the intermediary between the writer and the publisher when it comes to the manuscript itself. The editor is hired by the publisher, so in that sense serves the publisher, and works hand in hand with the writer to serve the reader. The writer, the editor, and the publisher share one goal: the best book possible. We are all working to that end, to produce the book that will best represent your intentions as the author and best serve the reader. As a representative of the publisher, the editor is responsible for delivering a manuscript on deadline that meets their expectations and reflects their house style. More on that later. So that's who your traveling companion is on the editing journey, their skills and their fundamental place in the ecosystem of book publishing. There are two main ways that you might work with an editor. One, by hiring a freelancer to assess and/or edit your manuscript prior to submission to a publisher or agent, or as part of the process of publishing independently, that is, self-publishing. I'll talk more about hiring a freelancer later. Two, by securing a publishing contract and having editors, yes, more than one, assigned to your manuscript by the publisher. In the first case, you're the one paying for editing services. In the second case, at least with a traditional publisher, the publisher covers the costs of the editing. Of course, if you're publishing independently, you're paying for everything and sourcing the help you need along the way. Another option is to work with a hybrid or partner publisher, someone who helps you through the entire process of turning your manuscript into a book. They pull together the team of people needed, the editors and the designers, and you pay for their help to do that. Some of that payment goes to the editing. Briefly, on the topic of independent or self-publishing, I feel obliged to mention that my earlier statement that editing is as essential to publication as writing is applies equally to publishing independently. So I'm going to walk through these various stages of editing, that is, the various steps you might take in the journey to get your ideas and/or your manuscript turned into a book. I say ideas and/or manuscript because the earliest stage of editing, developmental editing, can actually take place before you even start writing, at the idea stage. This mainly applies to nonfiction, including memoir, though it could also apply to fiction. If you would like some help with determining an audience and the book's purpose, brainstorming and developing ideas, and/or developing an outline and a work plan for the writing, you could benefit from working with a developmental editor. Not every writer requires the services of a developmental editor, but if you find yourself bursting with ideas and have no clear notion how to start organizing them and getting them down on paper, a developmental editor can help. Once you've actually drafted a manuscript, the first stage of editing is, of course, self-editing. In a blog post on writersdigest.com, Tanya Egan Gibson points out something that some freelancers might not tell you. It has to do with self-editing and is the quote I've placed at the top of this slide. You should avoid the temptation to hire someone to edit your first draft. Tanya advises, quote, "Don't bring in a professional until you have made the book the best you possibly can on your own. Only when you've taken it as far as you can on your own will you get the most for your money in hiring a freelance editor," end quote. I completely agree. Luckily, there are lots of great resources out there with advice on self-editing. The Editor's Eye, a practical guide to transforming your book from good to great by Stacey Ennis, is one of the most useful books I've found and one I highly recommend for first-time authors. On the resources page of my website, I talk about a couple of other excellent books on self-editing, which I've also listed here. It's once you reach the point where you feel you've taken the manuscript as far as you can, that point where you've revised it so much that you're having a hard time seeing the forest for the trees, that point where you're wondering, does this even work? That's when it's time to avail yourself of the services of an editor. At this stage, you might want to start with a manuscript assessment. Basically, a freelance editor reads your manuscript and assesses its strengths and weaknesses and the kind of work they would recommend you do to bring it to the next level. The editor doesn't actually edit the manuscript, but offers a write-up detailing their assessment and providing a blueprint for suggested revisions. Because a manuscript assessment does not actually involve editing the manuscript, the fee for an assessment is usually determined using a set formula that is based on word count. By contrast, in most cases, the fees for the other stages of editing are charged by the hour. Again, I'll go into that in more detail later. When doing an assessment, I prefer to read the manuscript cold, without being told much at all about what it is or what to expect. That may sound odd, but I feel my job is to assess what's on the page, whether the writing can speak for itself, whether it says what needs to be said. If you've told me all about it in advance, that will color my reading. I won't be able to unhear or unknow what you've told me. I won't be able to read without any preconceptions. After all, the reader won't likely have the benefit of the author telling them what their book is about. That said, it's helpful to know upfront who your target audience is. I need to know whether you've set out to write for a middle grade or young adult readership, for example, as this will factor into my assessment. But I don't want to be told much more before I have a chance to discover for myself what's actually on the page. As I mentioned, once the manuscript assessment, often 6 to 10 pages of detailed notes for a book-length manuscript, offers a blueprint for suggested revisions. Once you've revised the manuscript using the assessment as a guide, you might want to hire a freelance editor to strengthen it further, or you might feel ready to submit to a publisher or an agent if that's the route you'd like to pursue. I want to mention something at this point. Often writers who hire me for a manuscript assessment ask me whether I think their manuscript is publishable. That is, whether it will secure a traditional publishing contract. I have to tell them, and I will tell you now, I am in no position to say whether any particular manuscript will be what any particular publisher is looking for at any particular time. That's an agent's job. But I can say with absolute certainty that the stronger your manuscript is at the time of submission, whether to a publisher or to an agent, the more likely it is to catch their attention and interest. And in truth, a good number of manuscripts I edited prior to submission have gone on to secure publishing contracts. One other quick note, as an editor, I'm happy to assist my clients with their submission packages to help make sure they're as strong as possible. Before I move on, are there any questions about a manuscript assessment?
I don't have any questions about a manuscript assessment. We do have one Q&A, but I think it might be pertinent later in the presentation. So I'll ask that attendee to hold that question for a little longer.
Very good.
And I don't see anything in the chat either. So I see another question has just come in. I wonder what a typical cost might be for the fee based on word count.
So I can tell you the formula. I take the word count and I transpose it into pages by dividing it by 250, which is the standard word count, considered a standard word count per page. Then it's $100 for the first 10 pages and $1.50 per page after that. So it's a big math equation, but yeah, that's how I do the math. So, I mean, you could do that same math too. And I can go over it again later if need be, but that's how I work it out. All good? We'll go on.
Yes, and I've just also had a comment. There was a few more questions have popped in. Okay, we have, I also got informed, thank you for whoever informed me that the chat was not, did seem to be disabled. I've changed a setting, and if the chat is now working, if anyone would feel free to just pop in an answer to say yes, no. Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. We have a couple of more questions. Jessica asks, I saw an editor offer an assessment based on only the first 50 pages. That seemed odd to me. What do you think?
That seems odd to me too, especially for something like a novel where the whole matters. I don't understand how you can assess something on only a portion of it. You know, I don't work with other editors, so I don't always know what other editors do. I just know what makes sense for me. But you know, we will get into talking about hiring a freelancer, and you certainly want to find someone that offers what you think makes sense.
Okay, we had a couple of follow-up questions. Can you please repeat the cost for the first 10 pages? And related to that, there was a question, was that $100 for the first 10 or first 100 pages?
Yeah, no, it was for the first 10. And to be clear, that's just for the sake of doing math. So in other words, the first 2,500 words. Oh, don't ask me to do math on the spot, you guys. There at the end, I do share my email address, and I don't mind answering questions via email, but and I'll also be honest, I've been thinking that I'm charging too little for manuscript assessments. I know that what I've been charging is low. I've been charging the same thing for 15 years. So don't get too caught up on my math, because other people are probably charging a bit more, and I might need to raise my rates too. But again, anyone who wants, I can share that formula with you later. Shall we go on?
I have one further question, but it might be something that we'll come back to as we go further into the presentation. The question from Cheryl Lee is, I was told to get a developmental editor, a stylist, and the list goes on. Is it all necessary? Do you want to defer that question to later, or?
Please save it. It's a good question, but I do think what's coming up might help address it.
Okay. All right. In that case, I think we're ready to continue. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks, everyone. Here we go. So let's say you've submitted your revised manuscript and it has caught the attention of a publisher. In traditional publishing, you are likely to work first with an acquisitions editor. Acquisitions editors are the gatekeepers for the publishing house, the ones who acquire manuscripts for publication. Typically, acquisitions editors don't actually edit your manuscript. My focus on this presentation is on the various editors who do. Once a manuscript has been accepted for publication, the managing editor will assign an in-house editor to shepherd the book through the editing, design, and production process. That person might do the editing work themselves, or the managing editor might contract a freelancer like me to start working with the author to edit the manuscript. The next step in the editing process is substantive editing, the first of the stages where the editor actually starts editing the manuscript. Whether with an editor assigned as part of a publishing contract or with one you've hired yourself, either because you plan to publish independently or because you want to polish the manuscript further before you submit it to a publisher or an agent, from this point, the writer and the editor embark on a journey together to transform your opus from a manuscript to a book. Until this point, you've largely worked away on your manuscript alone. Now you have a traveling companion on the editing journey, someone who will come to know your manuscript almost as intimately as you do. Let's say I'm the lucky duck hired to work with you at this stage in the journey. Sometimes the publisher tells me upfront what their expectations are for the finished book, or they outline particular concerns, things they want me to have in mind as I start editing. Other times, I'm approaching the manuscript with little or no preconceptions at all. Depending on the timeline, that is how much time is allocated for editing, I either start editing right away on my first read through, or I print the manuscript out to give it a first read without editing as I go. Either way, I'm making some big picture notes of first impressions, what I like about the manuscript, what I find confusing, where any sticky areas are. There may be sections that just don't seem to fit, ideas or elements that need to be fleshed out, redundancies and repetitions, and of course, sections that are just right as they are. In essence, these big picture notes are a manuscript assessment. On their website, Editors Canada outlines the core skills an editor brings to each of the stages of editing. They say that substantive editing, which they call structural editing, may include, among other things, revising, reordering, cutting or expanding material, and clarifying plot, characterization, or thematic elements. In fiction, the kinds of notes that might come up at the substantive stage are things like gaps or wrinkles in the timeline of the narrative, underdeveloped characters, confusing shifts in point of view, basically anything and everything that contributes to or could hinder a strong, engaging story. I share my big picture notes either in an email or in comments inserted in the digital file using track changes. I point out the sections that are particularly strong, and I highlight the areas that need clarification. I also offer suggestions for the kinds of revisions I think are needed. And suggestions is the key word here. Any changes the editor proposes are just that, suggestions. And you, the author, are, of course, free to reject them. No substantive changes get made that are not fully approved by the author, ever. That said, the hope is that you will give my suggested edits due consideration, because that's what I've done with your manuscript. I've read it carefully and with my full attention, and the suggested edits are made in the spirit of making your work even stronger, more clear. Where I think it's necessary, that is, where it might not be obvious, I explain the reasoning behind my suggestions, and I'm always happy to provide further explanation for any of my proposed edits. I'm also always happy to be corrected if it turns out I've misinterpreted something. But if I have, the chances are the reader would too. So that's usually an indication that some revision is necessary. In preparation for this webinar, I invited comments from authors on the editing process from their point of view. Novelist and poet Anna Kwan said, "You do have ultimate authority over your text, but you must give readers what they will need to read the book as you want them to, and the editor is trying to help you do that." End quote. She went on to say, "My job as the writer is to give the editor's suggestions some thought and make my case for my opinion. But you also need to be open to changing your own firmly held idea and to challenge yourself when it seems your work might not be understood the way you want it to be." End quote. Again, working with you to make sure the reader gets it is very much at the heart of what I do as an editor. More often than not, the comments I make on a manuscript are posed as questions. I want to make sure I understand your intentions. I want to open a dialogue around those issues that require clarification. In essence, editing is a conversation. For the conversation to be productive requires a relationship based on openness, honesty, trust, and mutual respect. I feel honesty is very much my stock in trade, that it's my job to give my honest opinion, even when it might not be what the author hopes to hear. Let me tell you, I am keenly aware that it can be hard to hear that something you've worked so hard on is not quite hitting the mark. I can't tell you how often I've worried that an author might be offended or upset by my feedback, no matter how carefully and diplomatically I've worded it. But again and again, authors respond with thanks, telling me that what I've shared is what they really needed to hear. So yes, honesty is key. So is trust. Trust that the editor has your best interests in mind, just as the editor trusts you to know ultimately what is best for your book. And you should always feel that the editor respects you and all that you've put into bringing your manuscript to this stage. The blood, the sweat, the research, the passion. A good editor recognizes the author's vulnerability and understands the great responsibility vested in them to nurture and care for the author's baby. Excuse me. Editing is an intimate relationship, particularly at this stage, the substantive stage. To be able to do their job effectively, the editor has to get inside the author's head, understand the author's intentions. And while writing is a form of personal expression, it's important for you, the writer, to understand that when the editor points to flaws or weaknesses in the writing, they're not criticizing you personally. It's about the writing, not about the writer. A good editor, in sharing their feedback, makes this clear. You, the writer, should never feel that the editor is criticizing you. Rather, it should be clear that the editor only wants to help you make your writing as strong as it can be, writing that truly reflects your voice and your intentions. With trust and mutual respect at the core of the author-editor relationship, each side should feel comfortable sharing opinions and speaking up for their point of view when that seems to be warranted. Again, edits are suggestions, and editing is a conversation. If you disagree with the suggestions, you should say so. Any editor worth their salt will be open to engaging in a conversation with you about their suggested edits. Be open to trying what's being suggested. Chances are it could lead you to find something even better. Another writer I asked for his thoughts on working with an editor is a past client, award-winning novelist and picture book author, Philip Roy. He likened the editing process to being asked as a child to clean up his room. It took a lot of effort and was not something he really wanted to do, but he says, I was so delighted to have a clean and tidy room afterwards, and it put me in a good mood. Philip was adamant that, quote, you always have a stronger piece of writing after you've worked with an editor. That's the basic truth. An editor makes your work better, end quote. In The Editor's Eye, Stacey Ennis offers some tips for a good editing attitude, which I've adapted here. Don't take edits and feedback personally. Remember that manuscripts are organic. They grow and evolve over time. Don't be afraid to kill your darlings. Be willing to let go of writing that isn't serving the overall vision for the book. Commit fully to the book writing process and believe in yourself. This includes speaking up for yourself and advocating for your position if you feel the editor isn't quite getting it. And trust your editor to help transform your book from good to great. As I mentioned, it's at the substantive editing stage that the editor actually starts marking up the manuscript, editing the digital file using track changes in Microsoft Word. In case you're not familiar with the track changes tool in Word, it makes visible every change that is made to a document and gives the user the option to either accept or reject each change. It also allows the user to insert comments on the text. If you have any questions about track changes, feel free to post them. So now we start sending the digital file back and forth, 3, 4, 5 times or more, as each change or new bit of writing also needs to be edited. Remember I said we'd get into some specific tips and tricks for working with an editor? Here are some guidelines for making this back and forth process work efficiently. First, it's extremely important that there only be one person at a time working on the file. That means you can't continue working on the file once you've sent it to the editor. You have to wait patiently until they send it back. Otherwise, you end up with different versions of the manuscript in play at the same time, and it can be a nightmare to reconcile them. Be sure track changes is on before you start working with the file so that when you send it back, your editor is able to see exactly what has changed from the last version of the draft. This saves a lot of time. If the editor can't easily see exactly what has changed, they have to read the entire manuscript again, which isn't necessary when only scattered sections have been altered. Don't worry, the editor will read the entire manuscript again once you're finished with the back and forth. As you're reviewing the edits, feel free to accept the ones you approve of, but instead of hitting the reject button for the ones you do not agree with, insert a comment. The comment could be as brief as the word "stet," which means let it stand or leave as is, or it could explain why you do not approve the suggested edit. Either way, inserting a comment lets your editor know that you've seen and considered their edit. It also allows them the opportunity to respond with a further explanation of why they feel a change is needed, if that's the case, though oftentimes knowing you feel strongly about the way you've worded something is enough for the editor to leave it well enough alone. And just as important, flagging the suggested edit rather than rejecting it means the editor won't make the same edit again, as they might do if you simply rejected it using track changes, because once a tracked change is rejected, the markup disappears. There's no longer any trace of it. Save each draft as a separate file. That way, nothing will be lost. We might decide at some point to reinstate a section from an earlier draft, or you might decide you'd like to repurpose a deleted section for another piece of writing. And that's a point I'd like to share. Just because I'm suggesting chapter 3 doesn't really fit in this book doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good piece of writing. Maybe it's the germ of a separate article or a new short story or a whole other book. It just doesn't belong in this book. Substantive editing is the most intense editing phase. Through this process, which generally lasts several weeks, if not several months, the writer and editor form a significant bond. The editor is getting to know your manuscript inside out. Ideally, the editor carries your voice and your intention in their brain and reflects that in their suggested edits. Next to you, the editor becomes the one other expert on your manuscript. By the time we've gone back and forth 3, 4, 5 times, the big stuff is getting all sorted out, and we're basically moving on to the next stage of editing, copy editing. The lines between substantive editing and copy editing are somewhat fluid, as is apparent by the fact that they are both referred to by various people as line editing. These later stages of editing are really a continuum and often bleed from one into another. While some substantive editors leave copy editing to someone else, I, for one, tend to copy edit as I go, editing for grammar, spelling, punctuation, and usage, as Editor Canada says on their website, where they list the core skills of copy editing. That said, once the main back and forth of the substantive edit is done, I always print the manuscript out on paper and read the entire thing again, start to finish, and inevitably I catch things that were missed along the way, most of them copy edits. It never ceases to amaze me how reading on paper shows up things that escape attention when reading on screen. And even after you and I have completed a substantive edit of your manuscript, which for me includes copy editing, the publisher will likely hire a separate copy editor. And that's a good thing. It never hurts at this later stage to have fresh eyes reading the manuscript, because by now I'm as familiar with it as you are, and my eyes are no longer entirely fresh. The copy editor has basically memorized the Chicago Manual of Style, the Bible of English language usage, and the go-to style guide for book publishers. Additionally, one of the key roles of the copy editor is making sure the manuscript adheres to the publisher's house style. Every publisher has their own, whether they use the serial comma or not. I, for one, am a big fan. Which dictionary they use for spellings, the main one for Canadian publishers being the Canadian Oxford Dictionary. Whether to spell out numbers up to 10 or up to 100, whether em dashes and ellipses are closed or open, their documentation style in the case of academic and nonfiction books, etc., etc. The style guides I have on hand for the various publishers I work with range from 6 to 20 pages in length. The copy editor has this guide memorized, or at least readily at hand. The copy editor also prepares a style sheet specific to your manuscript, detailing particular spellings, including personal names and proper nouns, or approaches to punctuation and so on that you've agreed upon. This style sheet then gets passed along to the proofreader so they don't inadvertently correct those particular, perhaps non-standard things you and your editor have agreed upon. Perhaps the biggest job of the copy editor is to ensure consistency, that the agreed upon style is applied throughout the entire manuscript. As they read, the copy editor is looking out for any inconsistencies and will also identify areas that need clarification or revision, stuff that managed to slip through the substantive stage. Copy editing is the finessing stage. The big picture editing is done, everything is in its place, the narrative arc is complete. Now it's time to make sure the nitty-gritty is also dealt with. The copy editor is not only reading every word, but is also attuned to every single piece of punctuation. This is where being a slow, careful reader really comes into play. I'd like to read you a passage from a wonderful book, one I highly recommend, called The Subversive Copy Editor, Advice from Chicago by Carol Fisher Soller, written when she was a senior manuscript editor at the University of Chicago Press. The book is written for copy editors, but also includes a chapter for writers, so I encourage you to check it out. In this passage, Soller is addressing copy editors who are, quote, enjoying the pleasures of working at your craft, end quote. I love the analogies she uses to describe this crucial stage in the editing process. Quote, the midwife works with a laboring woman to produce a healthy child. A seamstress or tailor finishes the couturier's garment until it's a perfect, flattering fit. Carpenters and masons execute an architect's vision and take pride in a safe and well-functioning building. What we all have in common is our wish to cooperate, not compete, with the originators of our material, and we share a satisfaction and sense of accomplishment when everything is going well, end quote. The Booker Prize-winning author George Saunders proposes another analogy. He's talking about, quote, the thousands of incremental adjustments an artist makes when revising their own work, but his simile can also be used to describe the conversation between editor and author. He says, quote, the artist is like the optometrist, always asking, is it better like this or like this? The copy editor is very much like Saunders' optometrist, offering suggestions, trying to get to the very best adjustment to sharpen and clarify the writer's vision. Editing is not a science, it's an art. Yes, there are some rules of spelling and grammar, for example, and an editor is an expert in these, but at the substantive stage in particular, though also at the copy editing stage, many of the editor's suggestions are based on instinct, on an innate, deeply bred sense of what works and what doesn't, or what might work better. Editing is subjective. This is precisely why openness and flexibility are the hallmarks of a strong author-editor relationship. Editors have an ear for language. Oftentimes, the best justification I can offer for a proposed change is because it sounds better. I've absorbed the rhythm of what has come before and what follows, the beats in the writing, the pacing, the repetition of words, syllables, individual letters. Susan Bell, author of The Artful Edit, says to edit is to listen. And the late Ellen Seligman, publisher at McClelland and Stewart and vice president of Random House Canada, said, quote, to be a really good editor, you have to be a really good listener. I don't only mean to the author, You have to listen to what you're reading, end quote. We all become tone deaf to our own quirks and habits of language usage. You might be completely unaware how often you use particular words and phrases, for example, or how frequently your sentences are constructed in the same way. An editor's ear is attuned to these repetitions, and we flag those quirks and offer alternate wordings that will make for a more pleasurable reading experience. Of course, there comes a time when the tinkering has to stop. The deadline has come and your manuscript has been copy edited. It's time to submit it to the publisher, who sends it on to the designer to lay out the pages. That done, your edited manuscript actually looks like a book. But before it goes to the printer, the final stage of editing takes place, and that's proofreading. Proofreading, interestingly, is what most people think of when they think of editing. That is just about looking for errors. Proofreading is that and more. It's literally reading the proofs, the final laid out pages. It's the proofreader's job to catch any errors in grammar, spelling, capitalization, and punctuation that might have been missed in the earlier stages of editing, as well as anything that might have gone awry in the process of laying out the text. Things like awkward line breaks or misnumbered pages or missing photo credits. The proofreader has not only memorized the Chicago Manual of Style, but also the dictionary, the publisher's style guide, and the editor's style sheet, the one that's specific to your manuscript. Proofreaders are the ones who do the final cleanup, and I can't state enough how important and valuable this is. Think of Saller's analogies. If the copy editor is the tailor of the beautiful garment you, the writer couturier, have designed, the proofreader is the one who pulls off all the stray threads and takes the lint brush to it. Not to do that would ruin the effect of all the hard work that you and your editors/tailors have put into the garment, or in your case, the manuscript. The service a proofreader provides to a writer is to make sure up to the last minute that the writing is as polished as it can be, that you look absolutely gorgeous in your beautifully tailored and perfectly cleaned piece of couture. Another analogy, the proofreader is like the friend who makes sure you don't have egg on your face or spinach in your teeth. I'm sure we've all read published work that was not carefully proofread. The most recent novel by one of my favorite authors, Louise Erdrich, whose previous novel won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize, was written during the pandemic, is set during the pandemic, and was published during the pandemic by HarperCollins in 2021. So, needless to say, it was rushed through production, and sadly, it's rife with errors. A small example is the reference to a character in a grocery store pushing a, quote, red shopping chart, end quote. Spell check isn't going to pick up chart, which is a properly spelled word, but of course it's not the right word. Sadly, my beloved Louise Erdrich, highly acclaimed author, had spinach in her teeth, and no one had been given the task of telling her. Before I move on to some specifics about working with a freelance editor, are there any questions about the editing process?
We do have a few questions. There's one that's just been placed in the chat by Helen. Helen, if you'd like to just fill out that question, if you'd like to pose it as a question, please add it to the Q&A, and if you can add a bit more information about what point you were querying. Going back through the other questions about this section of the presentation, Jackie asks, can you keep a history of all of the track changes in the MS?
A history. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but certainly if you continue to save each draft, as I suggested, you'll be able to see the different versions with all of their track changes. So I think maybe that's what you mean.
Jackie, if that doesn't fully answer the question, feel free to pop in with more of a clarification. Another question has come up. I do all my writing on my iPad. Is there a way to do track changes editing from an iPad?
I am not someone who can answer questions about technology very well. So I don't know. I do know that authors who worked on Mac would send me documents created in Pages, and there is a way to convert those to Word, and so that we could see each other's track changes. But yeah, sorry, I'm no expert at, especially I work on a PC and with Word, and that does seem to be the standard, but for sure there are ways for these different versions to talk to one another. I'm just not an expert in them.
Okay. Just before I go on to the next question, I do see some questions going into the chat. I would ask participants, if you have a question for Marianne, please type it into the Q&A if at all possible, so that we have them marshaled in one area and she will be able to retain them afterwards. Let's see. Fiona asks, how long would it take for the copy editor to produce a manuscript style sheet, and does it need back and forth?
No, it's something that the copy editor is creating as they work. So as I'll just use the personal pronoun, shall I? So as I'm reading through a document, I'm keeping track of particular spellings, particular terminology that might not be familiar to the proofreader, and capturing them in a running list on my style sheet. So it's something that the copy editor creates on their own. So not back and forth with the author, but on their own as the editing process continues, so that they'll have this document that will go on to the proofreader and show, as I said, kind of what's already been decided about specifics to this for this manuscript.
Yes, I think that's a good way to describe it, Fiona. It's a documentation of the decisions that have been made as the work progresses. Right. Between the editor and author. Okay, thank you. Next question is from Marnie, who asks, if writing a book based in England around 1900 and you hope your book is read worldwide, would you still use the Canadian Oxford Dictionary?
Good question. Good question. That would be a decision made by the publisher, I would think. Yeah, that would be a decision made by the publisher, and that would be a decision made by the publisher.
Okay.
And that would then, whatever they decide, that would be the guide that the editor would use. They would run with that. I mean, there are things that I edit that don't use the Canadian Oxford Dictionary, and I simply then refer to Merriam-Webster or whatever else it is. But yeah.
Okay, another question. I read books all the time that have spelling and grammar errors. This seems to be an increasing phenomenon. How can we stop this? Should we notify the publishers of the errors?
Oh man, I've sweated over that one. I've flagged errors in books I've read that I loved and debated whether to contact the publisher and say, are you aware? And I haven't been able to answer that question for myself. I don't know whether it would only come into play if perhaps it was going to a second printing and they felt they could invest in correcting errors. It's incredibly frustrating, especially as a proofreader. And I don't know what the answer is, but all we can do is make sure our own work is as free of error as possible.
Good point. And it does speak to the frustration that a reader can feel that the writer or editor may not, realize when that does get passed, how that it does indeed frustrate readers. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you, Carol. I mean, this precisely is what an editor brings to a manuscript, right? Is removing anything that can detract from the pure enjoyment of your work.
Okay, and Helen asks, in the comment about, is it better like this or like this? And that, you know, the optometrist comparison, Helen asks, isn't that what writers do too?
Yeah, and that's what George Saunders was saying. He's talking about writers, that they're constantly asking themselves that same question. And all I'm saying is that then your editor is likewise going to do the same. Like, have we got it, or is there an even better way? And a slight adjustment that could make this even sharper.
Okay, another question. What about stylistic editing? Is that a step in the editing process of a manuscript?
It is, and it's just another word, another term for an earlier stage. Honestly, I don't know if I don't use it, and so those who do, I don't know if they apply the term stylistic editing to what I call substantive editing, or if it applies to what I would call copy editing. And I mentioned how both of those also get called line editing, which I think can be called stylistic editing. And Carol and I were talking about this actually just before the session started. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what they're called, as long as, you know, the sweep, that continuum of editing is happening. What their stages are called doesn't matter. It's just, you know, that we're working from dealing with big picture things right through to the minute details. So best to think of it as a continuum. And if someone is telling you, well, I feel it needs a stylistic edit, ask them what they mean. Just ask them what they mean. It is confusing. I'm confused too.
Yeah, and good advice that it's always worth asking what steps do you, the person who's asking the question, feel are encompassed in that stage?
Exactly.
And undoubtedly every editorial process would include the same stages, but just maybe with slightly different labels.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And again, as long as that range of work is happening, what they're called doesn't really matter, but again, you seek clarification if you're not sure what's being referred to.
Okay. Jackie confirms that yes, you answered her question about saving drafts.
Good.
Cheryl Lee asks, I was told it's better to first ask yourself the reasons why you want to write a memoir, which I have done, and now realize it's best not to write one at this time. Is this good advice?
I think so. I mean, actually, that's good advice for any piece of writing, I would think. You know, what is the why behind it? It's a lot of work creating a book-length manuscript in particular, but any piece of writing, of course. So yeah, you want to be really clear on the why, really clear on what is it you have to say, what is it you have to share. And if that's unclear, then yeah, maybe now's not the time. Maybe that needs to be sorted first.
Okay, Helen asks, the example of cart chart.
Yeah.
Chart could have been a technology problem. It's frustrating what some programs will change words to. Have you found that?
I know what you mean. I mean, I find that when I'm texting, for sure. But an editor takes the place of technology, right? I'm reading regardless of what spell check is saying, and often, I'll still see the red squiggly line under something that I know is properly spelled because my program is using American spellings and I'm using Canadian spellings. So, I'm an editor is in place of what technology recommends as the right usage. So it doesn't impede me from doing my job.
Okay, CJ asks, can you please repeat the name of the book that you mentioned a few slides back? I'm not sure which slide exactly, but Marianne, I know that you will have a link at the end to your website where all of the books are given, but
yeah, I've got them all beside me, the different ones I mentioned, and I wonder, I know I listed some particular titles on that one slide, and they're all on my website. the one I mentioned recently with the analogies, that's the Subversive Copy Editor, Advice from Chicago. But yeah, when we get to the end, if that's still unclear and anyone wants me to go through those books, I have them all here and I can share that again.
Okay. Can you explain the role of the developmental editor? You mentioned the DE is for before your manuscript is written, but my understanding is that a DE is useful for after your third draft, for example.
I think this is one of those same matters of just different terminology being used. In my mind, developmental editor is developing the ideas for a book, developing the outline, developing, the shape of how this idea might translate into a manuscript. So in my mind, it's kind of a pre-writing, a planning for writing stage, but I know that some people call what I call substantive editing developmental editing. So again, I would encourage people not to get too hung up on the terminology, but just to have a sense of that continuum, the way the stages, yeah.
Okay. You cued that the Canadian Oxford Dictionary is standard in Canada. Do you have a sense of what might be the usual standard in the UK?
I don't. I know that Merriam-Webster is the go-to for a lot of the work I've done for American spellings. I'm not certain about the UK, although I think it might be just the Oxford as opposed to the Canadian Oxford, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. A question also, at what stage would you recommend sensitivity readers?
Oh, great question. I would say fairly early, especially because they are much more in demand, properly so. So you'd want to consult if your material is sensitive in nature. I would suggest you consult with a sensitivity reader early on and get their guidance and input, which could also save potential missteps as you continue in the writing and editing process. Yeah, great question. I would suggest early on.
Okay. How do you approach the publisher when you disagree with edits that were made after your work? How to be collaborative, constructive with this process?
After your work, I'm not sure I 100% understand the question. I don't know what you mean by after your work. But in essence, I would just urge open communication. And it's kind of like what I was saying before about the relationship needs to be based on, honesty and openness and clear communication. So if there's anything going on at any point in the process that you're not feeling comfortable with, you need to say so and seek clarification. And yeah, so depending on at what stage it happens. So that's where the after work part, I wasn't clear what you meant, but if it's in the process of working with the editor, bring it up with the editor. If it's once the manuscript has moved on to the publisher and the editor has finished, there'll come a point where my work is done. I've submitted as a freelancer, my work is done. I've submitted to the publisher. I don't see that manuscript again. I no longer have anything to do with it. And they continue with it through the production process. So if that's what you're talking about, then you speak with whomever your point person is with the publisher and advocate for yourself.
Okay. Is the Chicago Manual of Style the standard to use from the start of writing a book?
Well, my answer to that question might be, don't worry about it too much. That's the editor's job. So don't worry. Make sure your job as the writer is to say what you got to say as best you can, and the editor will be the one who's concerned about the fine points of the Chicago Manual of Style. I would just encourage you not to get too hung up on it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay. At this point, I do see a number more questions coming in. Marianne, do you have more to continue with the presentation, and should we hold questions until afterward?
Yeah, there's
Okay.
Let's go on. And again, we should still have lots of time at the end, but I think we'll go on. Maybe some of the questions will be answered as I continue.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water. Hold on. Okay, so as I mentioned off the top, there are two main ways a writer works with editors, either because they've hired them directly or because their publisher has provided them, or both. Other than the role of an acquisitions editor, which is attached to a publishing house, all the other types of editing I've mentioned, developmental, substantive, copy editing, and proofreading, as well as manuscript assessment, are services offered by freelancers. Here are some things to keep in mind when setting out to hire an editor. First, make sure the editor is a good fit. Ideally, they'll have some experience in the type or genre of writing you do, though this is not always necessary. In fact, when it comes to nonfiction, it's often best that the editor not be a subject matter expert. For example, I'm not a natural cook, but I think that's what makes me especially well suited to editing cookbooks, and I have edited several. In the case of cookbooks, I stand in for that novice mentioned at the top of the presentation and make sure that the instructions, for example, are clear enough for a novice to follow. But especially when it comes to genre fiction, it's best to find an editor who is familiar with your genre. And while it's not necessary, it's not unreasonable to ask if you can either meet in person or via phone or Zoom to have an initial conversation, just to ensure you both feel comfortable with each other. A note on fit. If you get partway into the editing and discover the relationship is not working for you, even after talking things through, by all means, feel free to call a halt. Simply pay the editor for their time up to that point and move on. Second, discuss their fee structure. As I mentioned, the fee for a manuscript assessment is usually based on word count and is determined using a set formula. But for substantive editing, copy editing, and proofreading, I charge by the hour, and my hourly fee varies depending on the level of editing required. Basically, the heavy lifting stage of editing, substantive editing, has the highest hourly fee, and the lightest stage, proofreading, has the lowest hourly fee, with copy editing in between. Some freelancers charge by the word. I'm told that the standard by the word fees generally work out to be more or less the same as the standard by the hour fees. Please note, it's impossible for a freelancer to answer the question, how much will it cost, until they've seen the manuscript. Also, importantly, telling an editor how many pages your manuscript is not really helpful, as page count depends on the size of the font, whether pages are single-spaced or double-spaced, and so on. Rather than page count, tell them what the word count is. If you have a set amount of money budgeted for editing, don't hesitate to make that clear as you discuss fee. That way, the editor can, if possible, tailor their work to fit your budget. I suspect I'm not alone among freelancers in having a bit of a sliding scale when it comes to my hourly fee structure. I'm always happy to negotiate within reason, and I am happy to settle on a flat fee rather than hourly, as long as I believe it would translate to an acceptable hourly rate for the number of hours I estimate it might take. By the way, it's also very difficult for an editor to answer the question, how long will it take? Meaning, how long will the entire editing process take? While an editor can estimate how long it will take them to do an initial edit, they have no way of knowing how long it will take you, the writer, to make revisions and return the manuscript. Further, the editor can have no way of knowing how many rounds of editing might be required. It depends entirely on how the back and forth proceeds. That said, editors are experts at working to a deadline. If you have a particular time frame or ideal deadline in mind, communicate that up front. Don't hesitate to tell the editor what you need from them. For example, are you someone who works best when given lots of encouragement and reassurance? Or are you especially thick-skinned and would prefer that the editor just cut to the chase and tell you what's not working? The default setting for an editor ideally balances reassurance and encouragement with their delivery of the straight goods. But if you have particular needs in this regard, don't be shy about letting the editor know upfront. Be aware that even if you hire editors for substantive editing and copy editing prior to submission, the publisher has their own editors and may see the manuscript as needing more work after it's accepted for publication. And if you're publishing independently, you should plan to hire a separate proofreader. Remember, every professional who works on the manuscript is striving to make it even better, the best it can be. In a 2014 interview with the Globe and Mail, acclaimed best-selling author Kathleen Winter was asked, "What question do you wish people would ask about your work that they don't ask?" She answered, "I've tried to get people to ask about the importance of editors, the transformative power a superb editor can have, the satisfying work of sculpting away at draft after draft under the guidance of a magic person who knows when you're not done yet and calls out the shortcomings but doesn't presume to interfere or invade. It's an important collaboration that can make all the difference to a work, and yet the editor seldom gets any credit." As it says in the description of the book, What Editors Do, that I quoted earlier, when editing is done well, it is completely invisible. Readers only notice when something has been poorly edited, when the writing is clunky or in any way unsatisfying, or when errors have made it into the published work, as with The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. Otherwise, when a book is well edited, when there are no apparent errors or glitches, when they've had a satisfying reading experience, readers are quick to praise the excellence of the writing, and proper thing, the author is deserving of praise. The author is also the only one who really knows how much the editors contributed to the book's success. The most open, thoughtful, considerate authors acknowledge their contribution in the printed acknowledgements of their book and elsewhere. In her Writer's Digest blog post, Tanya Egan Gibson nicely sums up what it is to work with an editor. She says, "Our job in the end is to partner with you on a journey to reconcile your vision of your book with the way your prospective readers will see it, ultimately producing a book that says exactly what you want to say." So thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for all you do as writers. As I mentioned off the top, I have enormous admiration for writers, and I appreciate your effort, your dedication to your craft, and your desire to always improve your writing and connect with readers. I love my job, and I simply couldn't do it without you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And do please feel free to reach out to me about editing. I've got my email address and website there for you. And happy to take questions.
Thank you, Marianne. We do have a few more. I will mention that some of them may fall outside the scope of this particular presentation. I'll do my best to try to direct the questions to where they might be answered. But in the meantime, we'll go through these as quickly as we can, and please feel free to continue to add to the Q&A as we go. I have a verbal offer from a publisher. She tells me that her contracts department is backlogged. It's been 3 months. Is that normal? Is there any reason that they could retract their offer?
I don't work with contracts so much. I would guess that a verbal offer is an offer, and that I would think you should try to be patient. But I mean, congratulations. That sounds like great news. And I can't answer your question definitively, but I would think that an offer is an offer, and go you.
Okay, Rachel asks, can you clarify the role of the acquisition editor?
Again, I've not worked in-house, but it's my understanding is that an acquisition editor is the person who acquires manuscripts for their publishing house. That's so they're the one that agents have relationships with. So they'll receive submissions from agents. I can't tell you a whole lot more than that.
Okay. Do you ever work with folks that self-publish, and what does that process look like?
I absolutely do. I have many times, and it looks very much the same, truthfully. The editing process makes no difference depending on who's publishing it. The work still needs to be well edited. So yes is the answer. And yeah.
As a freelance editor, one thing I struggle with, the question writer says, is explaining to a writer that a sentiment they've written is problematic or might be interpreted by a reader as offensive. I consider it my duty as an editor to call it out, but it's so delicate. How do you approach the subject? Appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me, it's what I was saying about honesty being our stock in trade. It is our job to highlight things that can be problematic for the reader. That's 100% our job. And it's a matter of explaining that in the most sensitive and diplomatic way possible without mincing words too much. You know, that this is our role, is to make that intermediary between the writer and the reader, and we represent both equally and, you know, to each other's benefit. So it's a matter of just being clear and straightforward and sensitive, but making your case.
Okay, a quick answer I can give to Dale's question about will the PowerPoint be available for download? It will not, but this recording of the webinar will continue to be available on the Editors Canada website. So that is where you would be able to revisit the slides.
And I will just add to that, again, if you have any questions, anything particular about the presentation, do feel free to reach out. Things like, what were those books that I mentioned, or many of them are listed on my website. So I'm happy to continue to share information.
Hey, question from Marnie. A title is so important. Does an editor help with that?
Sometimes, although that's very much the publisher's job. That's their area of specialization. Sometimes the publisher will consult with me if I've been the editor on the book about my thoughts on a title, but generally that rests with the publisher.
Another question, more and more often publishers are asking for the developmental editing done before they accept a manuscript for publication. Is this your experience, and have you noticed this trend?
That absolutely does seem to be a trend. There are fewer and fewer in-house editors with publishing companies. So it's like I said earlier, the stronger any submission is at the point of submitting, the more likely a publisher will be to take it on. If they see that it's already gone through some serious rounds of editing, that's less work they have to do on their end, and that's going to be appealing to them.
Okay, similar question. Bethany asks, I have a picture book manuscript and I had it edited during a fundraiser. If I make the changes, what would be my next step? Should I be sending it to publishers hoping to get more access to editors, or should I try a freelance editor? I'm totally new to writing and would really love to have an editor.
Yeah, that's not unlike the last question, in that the stronger your manuscript is at the time of submission, the more likely to catch the attention of a publisher. So if you have the resources, I would encourage you to find an editor to have a good look at it before submitting.
Okay. When a writer is hiring an editor independently, does the writer pay for each round of editing, or does the fee include the whole back and forth process? This may be a depends kind of answer. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's a good question. as I mentioned, when I take on a substantive edit, and let's not get caught up on those terms. When an author hires me to edit their manuscript, I'm kind of as I work, I'm doing all those things. I'm doing substantive, copy editing, and proofreading. I'm not going to let a spelling error sit because it's not my job, that it's for someone else to worry about. I'm doing it kind of all at the same time. That said, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's a good idea to have someone else looking at the manuscript after that first editor has done their work. But to answer the question, when I'm doing my all-in-one editing, it's one fee. So that's included, the copy editing and proofreading is included in the substantive editing. It's all one fee. But then when you hire, if you are to hire a second editor, that of course would be a separate fee.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Daniel asks, would it be fair to say that an acquisition editor considers ideas or plans more than manuscripts?
Considers ideas or plans more than manuscripts. Ooh, I don't know. I think it probably depends on whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I know often publishers will respond to proposals for nonfiction. They don't necessarily need to see the full manuscript for nonfiction to acquire it. They'll say, yep, that's a great idea, or that's a great outline, or that's a great proposal, without needing to see the full manuscript. Whereas with fiction, they're going to want to see the full manuscript. I hope that helps.
Okay. Question about sensitivity reading. What is a sensitivity reader, their skill set, where to find one, or know if one is needed?
Good questions. So sensitivity readers this has become a bigger thing in publishing recently, and all for good reasons. But especially if you are writing about cultures outside of your own, for example, or experiences outside of your own. Say you have a character who has a physical disability, a character who is from another culture, you're white and you're one of your characters is Black, or a big one is if you have Indigenous characters or subject matter, you want to have a subject matter, a sensitivity reader from that culture, from that community, comment on your manuscript to make sure that you're accurately representing any cultures, experiences, abilities outside of your own. So that's what a sensitivity reader is. Some Google searches might help you find where to find them. I know, as I mentioned, they're much more in demand. There is this increased awareness of how important it is to make sure that we're representing various cultures and abilities and so on sensitively. So I would imagine a search will help you find those resources.
Okay, Rochelle asks, oh no, Rochelle makes a comment about she's been taking a few screenshots and she hopes that's okay.
Sure.
Another question, when an in-house editor suggests edits, are you obligated to send your newly edited manuscript to them, or is this just the polite thing to do?
Oh, I see. So, okay. I'm assuming that you've received comments from an editor at a publishing company suggesting revisions. I would say if that's the case and you've listened to their advice and you've made the revisions they've suggested, they've essentially opened the door to see the revised manuscript again. And I would say, yes, it would be in your interest to send them your revisions, because they've expressed enough interest and given you that amount of feedback that, like I say, they've opened the door, and you can say, hey, I took advantage of, I heeded your recommendations, and here's my revised manuscript. Is this what you meant? Does this meet your interest now? I would say yes, follow up.
Okay. Maury asks, could you please repeat the source where the Kathleen Winter quote appeared?
It was in the Globe and Mail. It was a 2014 interview she did with the Globe and Mail.
Okay. Marnie asks, how early should you contact the editor to work with you if you aren't sure how long it will take you to have your manuscript ready for an editor?
Oh, nice question. And here's, wow, I really appreciate that question, because many freelancers, I assume, are busy. And because, like, well, people doing book editing as I am, I have a bit of a backlog of book length manuscripts in my, in the pipeline. So a new client coming to me, it's going to be a few months before I'd even be able to start working on anything new. So this, as soon as you're getting to a point where you start to think, I'm soon going to need an editor, I would recommend that you start reaching out and researching editors and reaching out to see who might be available and when, because they aren't going to be able to start right away, almost guaranteed.
Okay. A question from Rachel that is an Editors Canada question, and this might also speak to some of the questions that have been coming up. She asks whether Editors Canada also represents poetry editors. If, as far as finding an editor, our participants might be interested to know that if you go to the Editors Canada website, there are resources there for the general public about what does an editor do, how to find one, and has listings also of editors if you're interested in looking for people or finding out about different types of specializations. That there's lots available on that site that you might want to explore in order to find more beyond the scope of this presentation, as well as checking with Marianne, of course. Another question, Marianne, do you edit picture books and board books? Would the fee scale be different for fewer words?
I do periodically edit picture books, not so often. And that is a question I have asked myself because mostly I'm working with longer form pieces of writing. The basic answer would be yes, but it's tricky it's such a particular skill set, editing picture books. But yes, I mean, the costs would be lower because they are shorter. But yes.
Okay. I'm just going to circle back. Cheryl Lee had the question earlier about, I was told to get a developmental editor, a stylist, and the list goes on. Is it all necessary? Cheryl Lee, if that hasn't been fully answered by the later parts of the presentation, feel free to pop in to elaborate on your question. Otherwise, I think that may have been covered when Marianne went through what are the different stages and when might it be done. It might be done by one person or by separate contractors. Not sure if that fully answered what you were asking.
Yeah, and just to kind of back that up again, it's a, feel free to seek clarification from the person who gave you that advice, what specifically they meant. But again, I would urge people not to get too hung up on those. Just as you've seen, there are many different words used for the same sorts of things. Point being, you want to make sure that, you've gone through at least 2 to 3 rounds of different, from big picture to right through to the final kind of proofread, to make sure your manuscript is as complete and as clean and as refined as possible.
Okay, and we have, I'm not sure if it's a question. Sharon has typed in just for fun, ... And we're in suspense, Sharon. We don't know what the rest of your question is. So Sharon, pop in if you have more to add to that question. Meanwhile, I see a number of people in the chat are expressing thanks for the wealth of information provided. the thoroughness. Sapphire says, I am humbled and bow to you editors. Thank you very much, Sapphire. Thanks on the information about when to look for sensitivity. Many thanks for the session. Right. At this point, we are just past the end of our allotted time. Okay. Sharon has completed the suspenseful question. Okay, she says, I was the page layout person for some Microsoft Press books. My name was usually at the back of the book, followed by page compositor. I was so tempted to put page composter just to see if the proofreader would catch it. Of course, I ran my idea by the tech editor and he said, don't you dare.
Love it. I actually thought about embedding some errors in my slides to see if anyone said, hey, wait a minute, you misspelled.
Yes,
So I get the humor, but yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, we're now just receiving comments of thanks and appreciation. And so I think that just about wraps up our session. I'd like to thank, on behalf of Editors Canada, thank you, Marianne, very much for this wonderful, thorough, and very informative session. I think you've shone a wonderful highlight on what the many roles of the many stages of editing involve, and all of the best practices for great relationships between writers and editors. So on behalf of Editors Canada, I'd like to thank Marianne. I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining us today. You were great numbers and great questions were asked. And once again, this recording of the session will be available on the Editors Canada website under the recordings page. And with that, I will end the recording and wish you all a good day. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.